Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a world of stone cloisters, flickering candlelight, and silent halls where the only thing louder than your thoughts might be the cheese. You're walking barefoot through a medieval monastery where the floors are cold, the rules are strict, and your dinner may or may not haunt your dreams. The air smells faintly of incense and damp linen, and as you clutch your woolen habit tighter, the silence wraps around you like an extra layer of penance. There's a thud in your gut, a slow rolling rebellion from that chunk of pale, rubbery cheese you had at supper. It's sitting in your stomach like a holy brick, and the monks around you, heads bowed in prayer, are pretending not to notice. But deep down, you all know that cheese was a mistake. Welcome to monastic life in the Middle Ages, where sleep was precious, cheese was controversial, and when something upset your stomach, you didn't complain out loud. You wrote it down in beautiful, grumpy Latin. You probably won't survive this era with your dignity intact or your bowels unbothered. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the refectory, where supper is long over and the cheese remains spiritually present. This was no soft brie or modern cheddar. Medieval cheese was often aged, salted within an inch of its life, and dense enough to injure a man if thrown hard enough. The monks knew it too, and some of them weren't happy about it. Inside a 12th century manuscript from an abbey in Burgundy, there's a Latin marginal note that translates, more or less, to "The brothers cannot sleep. The cheese has made war in the gut." It's hard to say whether the complaint was serious, sarcastic, or a bit of both. But yes, monks, chaste, serene, devout monks, were out here waging war against cheesies with nothing but prayer and passive-aggressive penmanship. Your bed, if you can call a straw pallet a bed, isn't helping matters. You shift, trying to find comfort while the cheese shifts with you. Some monks believed that rich food, even in small amounts, could lead to unclean thoughts in the night. You eat like a king, you dream like a sinner, one abbot wrote. Historians still argue whether these food dream linkages were actually believed or just metaphorical moral lessons wrapped in dairy dread. Quirky belief or not, the fear of cheese-induced lust or insomnia was real enough to be recorded. Several monastic rules, especially those from stricter orders like the Carthusians, explicitly limited cheese consumption to special days or banned it altogether. Others allowed it only on non-fasting days or required it to be soaked in water to lessen its strength. That's right, you're soaking your cheese like it's a misbehaving relic. And speaking of fasting, imagine this. It's Lent. You've eaten nothing but pulses and water for days, and now you're allowed a meager slice of cheese. You nibble it like it's gold. Then you spend the next 3 hours in the chapel praying not for forgiveness, but for digestive mercy. But why Latin? Why bother writing complaints about cheese in the same language used to discuss theology and salvation? The simple answer, because it was the language of all writing in the monastery. The funnier answer, because there's something oddly dignified about calling your dairy-fueled discomfort fermentum demonium, literally, demonic ferment. You scratch at your wool robe. It's itchy, the air is cold, and the cheese regret is very, very warm. Still, you stay silent. That's the rule after all. Silence after compline. But not in your heart. There you are composing a small ode to a cheese that betrayed me. And tomorrow, if you're on scriptorium duty, you might just slip it into the margins of a psalter, between a line about divine grace and a doodle of a snail fighting a knight. By the way, that's not a joke. Manuscripts really are full of strange, whimsical marginalia. Snails battling armored men, rabbits jousting, and, yes, the occasional suffering monk scribbled in the corner, hunched over with a sorrowful expression. Historians don't always know what they mean, but given tonight's theme, you can't help but wonder how many of those images were inspired by indigestion. The monastery bell rings softly in the distance. The night watch has begun. You roll over, trying to escape the pressure blooming in your gut. The room is silent but heavy with shared discomfort. Somewhere nearby, a brother stifles a groan. You feel seen. And in that moment, you understand something universal. Centuries may pass. Kingdoms may fall, but the human struggle against bad cheese? You shift under your thin wool blanket, still haunted by the cheese that dared to trespass into your cloistered peace. Outside, the wind tugs at the old stone walls of the monastery like a child pestering a sleeping parent. Inside, your stomach gurgles ominously, an ungodly hymn in the sacred stillness. Welcome to monastic sleep, interrupted not by sin or temptation, but by bloating and regret. Monks weren't known for complaining, at least not out loud. They were supposed to embrace suffering, right? Poverty, chastity, obedience, and occasionally a cheese-induced stomachache that felt like divine punishment. But despite the vows and silence, history is full of clues that the monks were far from immune to late-night dairy dilemmas. One major culprit? The daily fasting schedule. Depending on the order, monks could go hours, sometimes over half a day, without solid food. Their main meal was typically served mid-morning or early afternoon, and in colder seasons, that could be the only warm dish they got. Cheese, dense and slow to digest, often became the default protein. A convenient, preserved food that could be stored in cellars and eaten in small, monk-appropriate quantities. The only problem? It didn't always sit well. Imagine breaking a long fast with a slab of salty cow's milk aged in a moldy basement. Your gut is empty, your metabolism is crawling, and suddenly you drop in a medieval lactose bomb. That's not a recipe for enlightenment. It's a recipe for midnight mutiny in the intestines. Some monks wrote about this obliquely. One 13th century brother in a northern Italian monastery described in his diary how the brethren are subdued by fullness and unease, unable to chant matins without grimace. That's a very ecclesiastical way of saying everyone looked queasy during morning prayers. Historians still argue whether this was a recurring dietary complaint or simply the result of seasonal spoilage. After all, cheese storage was not exactly a science. But you can picture it, can't you? A long, dim stone dining hall, rows of wooden benches, steam rising from a pot of lentils, and next to it, cheese. Sometimes crumbly, sometimes rubbery, occasionally suspiciously blue-green. You're not entirely sure if that mold is intentional. No one is, but you're not allowed to ask, because silence is the rule. And so the monks learned to communicate their suffering creatively. Marginalia wasn't just for cheeky images, it was also a way to sneak in their experiences, thoughts, and yes, grievances. One manuscript from the Abbey of St. Gall contains a small side note next to a sermon. The cheese today was like stone, but no less holy. Even monastic medicine got in on the dairy drama. Herbal guides written by monks often included cryptic warnings about heavy curd or foul milk pressed in heat. Remedies for digestive upset were copied and recopied: mint-infused vinegar, warm honeyed water, crushed fennel. And the most drastic cure? Abstinence. Not from sin, but from cheese. A truly medieval sacrifice. By the flicker of your candle, you recall that some orders, like the Benedictines, had fairly lenient food rules. Cheese was allowed on most days, especially in regions where meat was scarce or expensive. But for stricter communities, like the Cistercians, cheese was approached with caution. They considered it rich, indulgent, and potentially soul-compromising. A monk from Clairvaux once referred to cheese as the tempter's wedge, a phrase that feels oddly modern in its passive-aggressive tone. And here's where things get really interesting. Monks weren't allowed to eat after sunset. Once the final bell rang and the last psalm was sung, the kitchens were closed. So if that cheese came back to haunt you, there was no warm broth or medicinal tea to comfort your suffering. Just your prayers, and maybe a guilty footnote in tomorrow's Psalter. Now, here's a fun little tidbit. Some monasteries actually had designated cheese days. Yes, like Taco Tuesday, but holier and far more gastrointestinally dangerous. These days were meant to celebrate local harvests or honor saints, and cheese, often made on site from cows or goats kept within the abbey walls, became the centerpiece of the meal. Unfortunately, not all monks were thrilled. One wrote, "On this day of Saint Ulrich, cheese did abound. My thoughts, however, remained elsewhere." What a polite way of saying, "I'm lactose intolerant and I hate it here." The irony, of course, is that cheese was also considered a blessing. In a world without refrigeration, it was a miracle of preservation. The process of transforming perishable milk into something storable, edible, and rich in protein was seen as a gift. In many illuminated manuscripts, Angels are shown helping peasants churn butter or carry wheels of cheese, because apparently even heavenly beings understood dairy logistics. Still, the monks struggled. Their cloisters were not designed for late-night pacing, but you do it anyway, shuffling past statues and shadowy arches, holding your middle like a man wounded in spiritual warfare. A faint echo of Gregorian chant floats in from the chapel, serene and steady, while your insides wage a Gregorian cramp. Eventually, you return to your pallet and lie flat, hands folded over your robe, eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling. The cheese has settled, for now. Tomorrow will be another day of prayers, scripture, maybe a little gardening, and probably more cheese. But tonight, in this moment of still discomfort, you are joined across centuries by every monk who ever thought, this again? And while they didn't speak aloud, they left you their whispers in Latin, muttered through the margins, scribbled on the edge of saints' lives, wedged between glosses on the gospel. Sleep comes slowly in the monastery, even more slowly after supper. Your stomach has calmed a little by now, just a quiet churn, like an old prayer wheel turning gently in the shadows. But your mind, well, that's another story. You lie there wondering, did the monks really think cheese was evil? Or was it just a scapegoat for everything wrong in their cloistered lives? Because once you start digging into monastic writings, a curious theme emerges. Cheese didn't just cause stomach aches, it could lead to sin. You heard that right. In some circles, cheese was whispered about like a culinary serpent in the garden. Rich, oily, pungent. It was too good, too indulgent, too sensual. Some monks described it as the slipperiest temptation. Others warned that it inflamed the blood and stirred the senses. One stern friar wrote, "Let the novice beware the cheese that awakens the loins." That may sound dramatic, but in an age where discipline was the cornerstone of salvation, even a brief flutter of earthly delight could feel like a betrayal. It didn't help that cheese sometimes caused vivid dreams, cheese dreams, they called them. Today we know that aged cheeses contain tyramine, which can affect REM sleep and intensify dreams. Back then, no such chemistry. Just monks waking up in a cold sweat, unsure whether their visions were divine revelations, demonic visitations, or just a spicy Gouda messing with their subconscious. Historians still argue whether these dream accounts were metaphorical, cautionary, or literal reflections of real sleep experiences in a diet-light, stress-heavy environment. One monk's dream journal, yes, those existed, described a goat with a woman's face chasing him through a vineyard after a particularly strong wheel of sheep's cheese. Was this symbolic? Prophetic? Just lactose-fueled lunacy? We'll never know, but the detail is hauntingly absurd. And of course, once anything became associated with temptation or loss of control, the stricter orders took action. Some monasteries banned cheese entirely during Advent and Lent, not just because it was rich, but because it represented richness. Cheese became an emblem of comfort in a life designed to reject comfort. That's deep. That's theological. That's unfortunate if you're hungry. Not all monks agreed, though. There were debates, heated ones. Sometimes they spilled into letters between abbots or entries in the consuetudines, monastic rulebooks. One abbot accused another of leading brothers astray through curdled indulgence. Another countered, better a brother made joyful by cheese than bitter with pride. That might be the most passive-aggressive theological burn in medieval Europe. There were even moments where monks tried to spiritually redeem cheese. Some abbeys blessed their dairy before consumption. Others compared the transformation of milk to cheese with the transformation of the soul through penance. A cheesy metaphor? Absolutely, but strangely poetic too. And here's a little fringe tidbit. A few mystic monks believed that cheese, especially soft-ripened varieties, could hold spiritual vibrations. A Swiss text from the 1400s claims that Saint Leontius could detect a man's moral standing by sniffing his dairy. From the scent of the rind, he wrote, I knew his thoughts were not chaste. Was that theology or just very specific paranoia? You decide. Now don't forget, monasteries made their own cheese. Most had cows or goats, sometimes sheep, depending on climate and region. Monks churned, salted, pressed, and aged wheels in cool cellars, often naming them by location. Brother Hildebrand's White Round, or Summer Cheese from the South Garden. They were proud of their dairy. But with that pride came danger. The more complex the cheese, the greater the risk. Mold, spoilage, over-fermentation. In warm months, bacterial growth could turn a mild wheel into a biological weapon. And when the resulting chaos struck, the fingers pointed not to science, they didn't have that yet, but to demons, sins, or improperly kept fasts. Cheese became the mirror of the monk's soul, unsettled, overripe, in need of discipline. One monastery even recorded a week of illness where 10 brothers could not rise for matins, afflicted by the curdled beast. They weren't being metaphorical. A surviving kitchen log notes that an entire batch of soft cheese had turned, though no one dared throw it out. Why? Because wasting food was a sin too. So they ate it anyway. And paid the price, in dreams, in gas, in marginalia. The night grows heavier. Your candle has burned down to a stub. A distant owl hoots, and you wonder if it's judging you for how many times you've shifted under this blanket, trying to settle your gassy medieval soul. But there's a strange comfort in this shared suffering. You, the monks, and 1,000 years of cheese-related confusion. Maybe that's the true lesson here. Even in the most ascetic lives, the body always wins a round or two. And sometimes the enemy isn't sin, or Satan, or even sleep itself, but a cheese wheel left too long in the larder. As you drift closer to sleep, the Latin phrases float through your thoughts like soft lullabies. Caseus vetus, peccatum novum, old cheese, new sin. You chuckle, just a little. A final gurgle of defiance bubbles in your gut, and then, quiet. You awaken before dawn, not fully sure you even slept. There's a thin line of light peeking through the high, narrow window, and somewhere beyond the cloister walls, a rooster crows with smug indifference to your bloated despair. It's time for morning prayers. But first, you'll need to contend with whatever last night's cheese is still doing to your innards. The refectory is quiet as you shuffle in with the other brothers, robes swishing against the stone floor, the air cold and slightly sour from yesterday's stew. You pass the long wooden table where your next meal will be served. Bread, maybe lentils, and of course, more cheese. It's always there. A slab of something grayish-white, aging not so gracefully in a wooden box near the kitchen hearth. But before you eat again, you remember what you're really curious about. What else did the monks eat to balance out this cheesy burden? The monastic menu was built around simplicity and abstinence, but that didn't mean it was free of quirks. A typical monk's diet in Europe during the Middle Ages was surprisingly repetitive. Lots of legumes, thick soups, dark bread, maybe a bit of dried fruit or herbs from the garden. Meat, only for the sick or infirm. Fish, sometimes, but only if it didn't swim too fancily. You'd think monks were immune to gluttony, but the truth is, they just channeled it into loopholes. Cheese was one such loophole. In theory, it was protein, a substitute for meat. But in practice, a bit too enjoyable. Rich, smooth, tangy, it tickled the senses. And even worse, it kept turning up in every dish. Cheese on bread, cheese in broth, cheese boiled with barley. One abbot even noted, the brothers have devised 10 ways to hide cheese in the lentils as though our Lord would not notice. A spiritual burn and a culinary critique, all in one line. Historians still argue whether monks truly believed God frowned upon flavor, or whether these were just cultural norms pushed to the extreme. But some texts are clear. Food that caused pleasure, or worse, digestive rebellion, was spiritually suspect. That's why the rules around eating were so detailed. You had to eat at the right times, in the right places, in the right silence. Silence, by the way, didn't mean the absence of complaints. It just meant you had to get creative. Enter the cheese signals. Yes, monks developed a whole sign language for food in the refectory, since speech was forbidden during meals. If a brother wanted more cheese, he might make a gesture resembling the cranking of a wheel, or even mime milking a cow. But there were also more subtle signs. One monk scratching his chest might mean, "This cheese is fighting me," while a slow, exaggerated blink could mean, "I'm entering a dairy coma." None of this is formally recorded, but modern scholars piecing together clues from rulebooks and marginal illustrations have uncovered hints that monastic meals were far more expressive than you'd expect. And then there's the cheese hierarchy. Not all cheese was created equal. Hard cheeses aged in cellars were prized, while soft cheeses were cheap, risky, and potentially French. In one particularly cutting letter from an English abbot to a visiting French prior, he complains, "Your cheese arrives as milk in rebellion." That's the medieval way of saying, "This smells like feet and tastes like regret." Some monasteries made their own cheese, and the variety could be surprisingly broad. Cow's milk for the wealthy abbeys, goat's milk for the mountainous ones, sheep's milk in the Mediterranean zones. Some cheese was salted and pressed, others left to mold naturally. And in all cases, the risk of spoilage was high. Without refrigeration, a bad wheel could turn overnight. And the resulting chaos wasn't just culinary. It could shut down an entire dining hall. One record from a Saxon monastery describes a cheese incident in 1184 where a faulty batch of curds caused great distress, interrupted psalmody, and a temporary suspension of vespers. They actually stopped an entire evening prayer because too many brothers were dealing with, shall we say, internal distractions. That's right, monks so gassy they couldn't sing. Of course, not every monastery was so uptight. Some took a more relaxed approach. The Cluniacs, for example, believed in elevating worship through beauty and comfort, including the food. Their abbots often hosted guests with multi-course meals that included artisan cheeses, local honey, and fresh herbs. Not exactly gluttony, but certainly more Michelin-starred than the average gray soup. But again, jealousy crept in. A rival Cistercian monk once wrote, "The Cluniacs dine like princes and sleep like sheep, fed full but blind to danger." That's the monastic version of must be nice. And let's not forget, monks traveled, especially those tasked with administrative duties or visiting other abbeys. That meant they got to sample the cheese of different regions, which often led to unfortunate comparisons. Imagine spending a week at a sunny southern abbey with light goat cheese and sweet wine, only to return to your northern stone pile and its musty brick of regret. It's enough to make even a holy man dream of rebellion, or at least a small culinary schism. The morning bell rings again. You rise with the others, stretch your aching limbs, and offer a whispered prayer, not for forgiveness, but for better cheese. A small hope tucked like a corner crumb beneath your daily duties. The kitchen is warming now, the smells of boiling grain and tangy dairy drifting through the stone corridors once again. And as you take your seat in the refectory for another round of silent chewing, you realize something simple. Maybe salvation isn't just about resisting temptation. Maybe. Sometimes it's about surviving the cheese. The cheese today is softer. That's the first thing you notice as you push it around your wooden plate with a spoon carved by some monk long dead. It glistens slightly, the rind torn open like a wound. It smells faintly of wet cellar and deeper regrets. No one makes eye contact at the table. Everyone knows this particular cheese. It has a reputation. You eat it anyway. Later, much later, after prayers, after sweeping the garden paths, after copying 4 more pages of St. Jerome's commentary on Isaiah without smudging a single drop of ink, you return to the scriptorium. It's cool inside, the stone floor echoing beneath your sandals. The air smells of vellum and candle wax, and now, faintly, of cheese. Because Brother Tomas ate too quickly and is regretting his life choices one pew over. His discomfort is audible. You open your manuscript, but it's hard to focus. Your gut churns like the butter churn in the abbey kitchen. So instead of working on the Latin glosses, your hand drifts to the margins. And there, next to a particularly dry passage on divine wrath, you draw a little monk. He is doubled over. His face is twisted. Above his head floats a small wedge of cheese, crowned like a saint. Congratulations. You've just joined a long, weird, holy tradition. Monks complaining about cheese, in Latin. The thing is, medieval monks were incredibly literate. At least the ones who worked in scriptoria were. They spent hours a day copying texts, illuminating letters, binding books. It was backbreaking work, often done in silence, and often done while hungry. And when you're exhausted, your fingers cramped, your belly gurgling from something you ate 6 hours ago, sometimes you break the rules and doodle, or mutter under your breath in very polite Latin. Some of these marginalia still survive. Not just doodles, but full-blown complaints. A famous one from a 12th century Irish manuscript reads, "Scripsi et manducavicacium, peius est nunc," which translates, very loosely to, "I wrote, I ate the cheese. It is worse now." You relate deeply. Historians still argue whether these notes were meant to be read or were just emotional graffiti. Some were subtle, a tiny frowny face drawn next to the word obediencia. Others were more elaborate. grotesque beasts made entirely of cheese curls attacking monks in miniature illustrations. One poor soul even added a recipe, scribbled between two lines of psalms, for a supposedly cheese-calming brew involving mint, milk, and blessed salt. The Latin, by the way, was always formal, always elegant. Even when the monks were talking about flatulence. Yes, that happened too. One marginal note reads, post prandium flatulentia supervenit, culpa caesae. After lunch, flatulence ensued. The cheese is to blame. Imagine writing that with a quill pen on priceless parchment next to a treatise on divine grace. It makes sense, though. Latin was the language of the church, of learning, of law. But it was also their only outlet. You weren't allowed to gossip. You weren't allowed to complain. But if you wrapped your discomfort in a layer of ecclesiastical Latin and tucked it into the edge of a manuscript, well, that was different. That was holy subtext. And this wasn't limited to one abbey or one century. From Spain to Sweden, monks left a paper trail of dairy despair. Their complaints weren't always about cheese, of course. Sometimes it was the cold or the ink or the fact that their fellow monks snored like an ox. But cheese appears again and again. Why? Because it was both omnipresent and unavoidable. You couldn't not eat it, and you couldn't uneat it once it was in you. One manuscript from a French monastery includes a tiny poem written in the corner of a page otherwise devoted to Augustine. Cassis oxeus delicium vel dolor, in or dulcis, in ventre horror. Translation? Cheese, O cheese, delight or distress. Sweet in the mouth, in the belly, horror. They were writing medieval haikus about gastrointestinal distress. You're beginning to understand that this wasn't just about food. It was about control, about the body's betrayal, about discipline and digestion being at constant war. And in that tension, Latin became the release valve. A side note for the cheese lovers, don't feel too attacked. Not all cheese got the same treatment. Young cheeses, eaten fresh, were usually gentler. Aged, hard cheeses were respected, even admired, but feared. Monks believed the aging process concentrated both flavor and spiritual heat. Some wrote that the older the cheese, the louder its voice in the night. That's either poetry or a gastrointestinal prophecy. Still, not every scribe was dramatic. One pragmatic monk simply wrote, "If I am to copy another homily, I require cheese that does not cry out within." Fair. The scriptorium is quiet again now. Your ink dries. You close the manuscript, your little cheese monk doodle smiling up at you like an inside joke from across the centuries. You stretch, stand, and feel the echoes of 1,000 monks before you who tried to keep their faith while managing dairy-induced chaos. This is how history survives. Not just in kings and wars, but in small, stinky frustrations muttered in a dead language. The scriptorium still lingers in your nose, parchment, wax, dust, and just a hint of last night's cheese wafting up from Brother Tomas, who has not moved for 20 minutes and may be silently communing with a saint or silently regretting a second helping. You step out into the cloister walk, needing air, only to be met with another olfactory ambush, the cheese cellar. You didn't mean to wander toward it. Your feet just carried you there, like a bad idea looking for company. It's not a pretty place. The monastery's cheese cellar is a low, arched chamber carved out of stone, damp as a cave and only slightly less ominous. Barrels line the walls. Rough wooden shelves groan under the weight of wheels in every state of decay, or ripeness, depending on your level of dairy optimism. You duck your head through the arched doorway. Inside, the air is cold and still and thick with the funk of ammonia, mold, and thyme. The smell hits you square in the sinuses. Some of the cheese wheels are coated in soft white fuzz. Others have gone black and crusty, like volcanic relics from a civilization that learned too late. You don't want to know what's under the cloth wrapping that's twitching slightly. Cheese storage in the Middle Ages wasn't a precise science. It was more like a prayer. Monks relied on cool air, shade, salt, and the grace of God. If a batch went bad, it could make half the abbey sick. And yet, they kept making it. Why? Because there weren't a lot of options. Milk spoiled, meat was rare. Cheese, if you could get it to the not lethal stage, was valuable. And it wasn't just food. Cheese had status. Some abbeys became famous for their dairy. Monks from Normandy exported wheels of pungent, soft cheese wrapped in leaves. Alpine monks made hard, nutty rounds that could survive winters buried in snow. These weren't just survival tools. They were luxury items. Nobles requested them. Traders paid well for them. Even bishops had favorites. But with status came scrutiny. There are records, real ones, of abbots inspecting the cheese cellar, like generals reviewing their troops. One 14th century letter describes an abbot weeping at the decline of our summer cheese, once proud and now deflated by heat. The phrase deflated by heat is believed to refer to the cheese's cracking or collapsing, but emotionally, you feel that too. And then, of course, there were the accidents. One especially dramatic entry from a Swiss monastery describes a bursting of the rind, after which several monks experienced visions and vomiting. The cheese was buried in the garden, and prayers were said. You wish that were an exaggeration, but it isn't. The cheese was given a small funeral, with a cross, in the cabbage patch. Historians still argue whether this was meant as satire, or if the monks really did believe the cheese had become possessed. There were rumors of demonic infestation in food, particularly during the later medieval period when fears of corruption and impurity were peaking. Cheese, with its ability to morph, ooze, and smell disturbingly alive, became a favorite suspect. Even the language around it grew suspicious. One abbot described cheese that ripens in secrecy as being like a heresy of the stomach. That's intense. And let's talk about noise. Yes, noise. One curious reference in an English abbey's kitchen book mentions a soft hissing from the older shelf, leading to the cheese being removed and set apart until such time as it quiets. Was it gas escaping? A fermentation bubble? Or was the cheese whispering Latin blasphemies under its rind? Who can say? It's easy to laugh now, but step into the monk's shoes, or sandals really, and you might understand their anxiety. They lived in a world of symbolic thinking. Cheese that turned too quickly wasn't just spoiled food. It was a sign, a warning, a test. And in a world without microbiology, everything had meaning. Even the accidents were elevated to parables. A soft cheese collapsing into a puddle during Lent might be taken as a message about pride. A hardened wheel refusing to slice could symbolize stubbornness. In fact, one mystic monk, Brother Anselm of Bremen, kept a dream diary where cheeses constantly appeared as metaphors for moral failings. In one entry, he wrote, "I did taste a cheese that was as stone and knew I had spoken too sharply to the novice." Sure, brother, that's definitely what the dream meant. And yet, these cellars weren't abandoned. Far from it. Some monks loved the process, the care, the waiting, the quiet hope that time and mold might turn chaos into nourishment. It's alchemy, really, one of the few forms permitted by the church. You begin to suspect that for every monk who muttered complaints in Latin, another was quietly in love with the mystery of dairy. Back in the present moment, your feet echo softly on the stone floor as you step closer to the oldest shelf. There, sitting like a king on a crooked board, is the legendary autumn wheel. No one remembers when it was made. It has a crack the shape of the Holy Grail and a smell like wet dog after confession. It's magnificent and terrifying. You stare at it in reverence. Then back away, slowly. Cheese this old deserves its own Gregorian chant. As you step back into the sunlight, blinking, breathing fresher air again, you carry with you a deeper respect for the monks who tended those funky relics. They didn't just store food. They stored time, patience, and a surprising amount of internal drama. Not bad for fermented milk. The fresh air helps a little. You've escaped the cheese cellar with your senses mostly intact, though you may be hallucinating faint bleats from phantom goats. You pass through the cloister garden, where the rosemary bushes sway in the breeze, and find yourself staring up at a modest statue of Saint Anthony, patron of lost things. You wonder, idly, if anyone ever asked him to help find their missing appetite after a bad wheel of cheese. Because as much as monks were expected to embrace discomfort, there were times when even the most pious among them couldn't pray their way through a cheese-induced crisis. It happened more than you'd think. In monastery after monastery, records mention brothers missing prayers, collapsing mid-chant, or being excused from work because their humors were disturbed. That's the polite way of saying they were doubled over in the infirmary, rethinking their life choices. And what's to blame in a surprising number of cases? Cheese. One chronicle from a Tuscan abbey notes that 5 monks fell into torpor and fever after consuming overripe goat's wheel kept past its blessing. The phrase, past its blessing, implies that cheese, like a guest, should not linger too long without divine supervision. The event caused quite a stir. The head monk wrote a letter to a neighboring abbey asking if the cheese had perhaps been cursed. Yes, cursed. You might roll your eyes, but this wasn't uncommon. Medieval monks saw the spiritual in everything. A digestive episode wasn't just biology. It might be punishment for pride or gluttony, or that one time you side-eyed Brother Aldrich during Mass. Monks were expected to reflect constantly, to examine every discomfort for its deeper meaning. And cheese, because of its volatility and prevalence, was a natural canvas for those anxieties. Which brings us to the sick rooms and the saints. The monastery infirmary was usually simple: beds or pallets, some clean linen, on good days, herbal concoctions, and lots of prayers. Monks who fell ill were tended by brothers trained in basic medicine, often drawn from monastic herbals and centuries-old wisdom. If you'd eaten bad cheese, you might be offered warm beer with ginger, fennel seed tea, or in especially dire moments, a purge of blessed herbs, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. But more interesting than the cures were the stories of miraculous recoveries, especially the ones tied to saints. Take Saint Gervold, a lesser-known figure from the Frankish region. Legend says he once cured a whole abbey of stomach cramps by placing his hand upon a cheese wheel and declaring it redeemed through suffering. The monks ate it tentatively. No one got sick. Gervold was canonized decades later, though not for the cheese thing, officially. Then there's St. Lutgard, who reportedly warned her convent about eating a particular batch of soft cheese, saying, "Its rind holds unrest." No one listened. That night, half the sisters woke up vomiting. The cheese was buried, and Lutgard's reputation as a mystic was sealed. Historians still argue whether this was genuine prophecy or just good instincts and a strong nose. Other saints weren't so fortunate. One tale, likely apocryphal but delightful, claims that St. Albanus was once struck with visions of sulfur and fire after eating too much sheep's curd at a festival. He took it as a divine warning and fasted for the rest of his life. Modern scholars suspect food poisoning, possibly botulism. Definitely dramatic. These stories mattered. They reinforced the idea that food was never just food, that your relationship to it, especially rich, complicated food like cheese, was a spiritual test. It wasn't just about gluttony. It was about vigilance, restraint, humility. And occasionally, the courage to say, "No thanks, Brother Gerard, I'll skip the third slice." The pressure, of course, could lead to improvisation. There's a curious reference in a set of monastic rules from the 1100s that warns against hiding cheese to consume in secret. That means at least one monk somewhere thought it was worth smuggling curds under his robe. The same rulebook also suggests that monks confess if they consume cheese while knowing its cause of unrest. Cheese-induced sin was a whole genre. You have to admire their consistency. And through all this, monks kept trying to solve the problem. Recipes changed. Salt levels were adjusted. Some monasteries began aging cheese in clay jars, claiming it absorbed impurities of spirit. Others began soaking cheese in holy water before serving it, especially during Lent. A few simply stopped making cheese altogether, choosing butter or dried legumes instead. Spoiler, the butter caused its own set of problems. But we'll get to that later. By now, your stomach has mostly forgiven you for the morning meal. You return to the chapel, where the others are kneeling for none, one of the many brief prayer breaks scattered across the day. The chanting is soft, measured, and beautiful. You close your eyes, and then, faintly, you hear it. A sigh, a shift, a subtle gurgle. Someone else is losing the battle. You don't look. That would be uncharitable, but you feel a deep historical kinship. Whoever it is, they join a long line of holy men who tried to live simply, pray constantly, and digest quietly, but who found themselves undone by cheese. Sleep tonight may be troubled, but at least you're in good company. You sit on the edge of your straw-stuffed mattress, hands resting on your knees, debating whether tonight is a cheese night or a maybe I'll just chew on a piece of dry bread and contemplate mortality kind of night. The wheel in the kitchen looked suspicious earlier, cracked, weeping slightly. It had a sheen to it that suggested more than age, possibly vengeance. Still, skipping supper isn't encouraged. The rule of St. Benedict allows for moderation, not starvation. So you line up with the others in the dining hall, avoiding eye contact with the cheese as it's silently plopped onto your plate with the same reverence one might give a relic or a warning. It jiggles. You pray. But before you take that first bite, your mind drifts. Because as much as monks suffered for cheese, they also studied it. Yes, studied it. Cheese wasn't just a nuisance. It was a puzzle, a product of chemistry, time, temperature, and divine providence. And monks, being among the few educated people of the Middle Ages, often became accidental scientists. While they didn't understand microbes or enzymes, they did understand observation and repetition, which, when you're working with a substance that might explode or cause visions, is a good idea. Some abbeys kept meticulous records of their dairy methods. These weren't cookbooks, exactly, but logs, dates, temperatures, measured by how cool the north wind feels, textures, smells. Curd firmed in 3 turns of prayer, one entry might read. Or turned foul after 3 sunsets, discarded with psalm. It's not exactly peer-reviewed science, but it's more methodical than you'd expect. Historians still argue whether these records were shared widely or guarded like secrets. Some suggest abbeys competed with one another for dairy prestige, tweaking brining times or layering flavors with herbs grown in their cloisters. Others believe the process was deeply local and spiritual, an extension of a monastery's soul. One particularly curious document from a Bavarian abbey describes the breathing of cheese. This wasn't poetic, it was literal. The monk noted how soft cheeses would expand and contract depending on the weather. He believed it meant the cheese was alive. And honestly, after seeing what you saw in the cellar, you're inclined to agree. And then there were the experiments. Yes, experiments. Not all monks accepted the cheese status quo. Some tried infusing it with lavender, garlic, even ash. One record from a Portuguese monastery suggests they tried smoking cheese over rosemary branches, possibly the earliest documented smoked cheese in Europe. The outcome? Fragrant, but loosens the bowels. Not a glowing review, but still, innovation. One truly rogue monk, Brother Jacinth of Alsace, apparently attempted to exorcise a particularly offensive cheese. The event was chronicled with all the solemnity of a real rite: chanting, candlelight, holy water. The cheese was placed on a linen cloth and rebuked for its rot. The result? It collapsed into a puddle. Jacinth considered it a victory. Others suspect it was just room temperature doing what it does. But the most ambitious monks didn't just tinker, they theorized. There are fragments of theological writings comparing cheese to the human soul. One treatise begins, as curdled milk becomes firm through pressure and time, so too must the sinner be pressed by trials and aged in virtue. It's cheesy, yes, but also kind of brilliant. You begin to understand how they found meaning in everything, even their intestinal drama. Some even wrote hymns, not entire canticles, but snippets, lines tucked into marginalia or appended to prayers. One favorite: O curd of dawn, O rind of night, blessed be thy stench and might. It's unclear if this was a parody or sincere. Monks loved their layered meanings. Humor was not absent from monastic life, it just wore a very subtle cowl. That said, not everyone was amused. Some abbots clamped down on cheese commentary. One strict prior outlawed all mention of dairy at the table, stating, "The brother who speaks of cheese shall eat none." That's harsh, but probably fair. The irony is, despite all the complaints, cheese endured. It remained a staple in monastic diets for centuries. It even funded them. Monasteries often sold excess cheese to local villages or passing pilgrims. The quality varied wildly, from divine to demonic, but the reputation grew. Some of today's most famous European cheeses can trace their roots back to monks. Munster? Benedictine monks. Tête de Moine literally means monk's head. Even Port Salut began in a Trappist abbey. Cheese was their curse, yes, but also their livelihood, their identity, their legacy. So you chew slowly tonight, savoring your slice with cautious reverence. You think of the monks who came before you, suffering, experimenting, doodling saints vomiting cheese wheels into the margins of Bibles. And you feel oddly connected. Not just to history, but to humanity. Because what's more human than trying, failing, and trying again to digest the things life hands you? Especially when they smell faintly of wet wool and taste like moral ambiguity. Your sleep that night is complicated. The cheese, as expected, stages its slow internal rebellion around Vespers and doesn't let up until you're deep into dreams where saints ride wheels of brie across fields of curdled clouds. You wake briefly to turn over, burping softly into the scratchy linen pillow, and silently curse Brother Tomas for encouraging you to take a second helping. He always does that. and he never suffers. You suspect divine favoritism. Still, you make it to morning prayers, barely. The bell sounds like it's coming from inside your skull, but you're up, robed, and kneeling beside 50 other groggy men in wool and sandals, all of whom are likely carrying their own quiet cheese regrets. It's a shared understanding, like a secret handshake, but with gastrointestinal undertones. Today, you're assigned garden duty, which is perfect, actually, because the monks' gardens, it turns out, were more than just a source of carrots and cabbage. They were medicine cabinets. 1,000 shades of green, trimmed hedges hiding remedies for the body, and perhaps more urgently, the stomach. This is where monks turned for relief when their internal monasteries were under siege. You walk the path slowly, trailing your fingers across the mint, the fennel, the sage. All gentle, healing herbs, anti-bloating, anti-burping, anti-regret. You think about how much of monastic life was trial and error, and how many brothers over the centuries must have found themselves doing exactly this. Wandering the garden after a night of dairy despair, wondering if God really intended humans to eat fermented milk. The herbarium, monastic texts on plants and their uses, are full of helpful entries. Fennel for digestion, mint for flatulence, wormwood for everything else. Some monks swore by a mixture of chamomile and wine as a kind of calming tonic. Others went further and developed elaborate rituals around cleansing broths, complete with prayers and very hopeful optimism. One particularly dramatic entry reads, "Take the root of the sweet reed, mix it with goat's milk, heat it with flame not higher than the width of 2 fingers, and drink while facing east. Repeat Psalm 42. If it fails, abstain from cheese 2 moons hence." That's dedication or desperation. Hard to tell. Historians still debate whether these remedies actually worked or simply gave the monks something to do, a sense of control over the chaos their diets often caused. Either way, the gardens became sanctuaries of relief, reflection, and very cautious nibbling. In some abbeys, certain herbs were even banned during fasting periods, not because they were harmful, but because they worked too well. Relief was seen, in some corners, as indulgence. Let the brother bear his discomfort as a trial, one abbot wrote. For the body must bow before the will. Easy to say, Abbot Hugo, when your cheese comes pre-selected by kitchen novices. The line between food and medicine was thin. Often, the same ingredients served both purposes. That tangy sheep's cheese from the South Garden, healing for the sick, or a test of faith for the well. That handful of lemon balm, a calming agent, or a garnish. Context was everything. Motive mattered. One brother's relief was another's relapse into indulgence. And of course, there were debates. Always debates. A particularly feisty exchange between 2 monastic herbalists survives in the form of marginal annotations in a recipe book. One wrote, "Peppermint alone calms the stomach. Fennel is of Satan." Below, another hand replied, "Fennel was in Eden, and you are a goat." That's medieval trash talk. And you live for it. You sit on a mossy bench near the basil, letting the morning sun warm your face. Your belly has settled a little. There's a sparrow hopping between 2 rows of thyme, and in that brief silence, the monastery feels less like a place of cheese-related hardship and more like a timeless rhythm of trying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. You remember a passage from the rule, "Let the weak brother have what he needs, lest he grow weary of the path." It's not just about physical needs. It's about grace. Maybe even grace for those who sneak back into the kitchen at night and carve off a little sliver of forbidden Gouda by candlelight. Hypothetically. And here's the thing. As much as cheese caused chaos, it also built something. These monks weren't just praying and fermenting. They were learning. They were documenting. Through their constant wrestling with this stubborn food, they preserved techniques, developed practices, and accidentally laid the groundwork for future culinary arts. Not in spite of their discomfort, but because of it. Modern cheesemaking owes more than it admits to these robed, sleep-deprived scribes. Every time you nibble a tangy blue or a creamy camembert, you're tasting the result of centuries of monastic trial, error, burping, and prayer. And so, as you lean over to pluck a sprig of fennel, not because you need it right now, but because you probably will later, you feel a kind of admiration for them, for yourself, for everyone who's ever tried to find the sacred in the squishy, smelly middle ground of survival. You chew the fennel, you forgive the cheese. By midday, you're back in the kitchen. Not because you're hungry. Your stomach is still locked in cautious negotiations, but because it's your turn to assist Brother Cormac, the monastery's unofficial cheese master. He's been in charge of the dairy process for longer than you've been alive, and smells vaguely of salt, wool, and ancient disappointment. Brother Cormac doesn't speak much. He grunts. He points. He sighs deeply when you stir the curds too fast, or not fast enough, or in the wrong direction, which seems to change depending on the season or the mood of the milk. You learn quickly that cheesemaking here is less about precision and more about instinct, weather, and sheer resignation. The milk today is fresh, from the Abbey's 3 cows, whose names you know but aren't supposed to speak aloud. Saints don't get named after livestock, and vice versa. The milk steams gently in a copper vat. You stir it slowly, rhythmically, while Cormac tosses in rennet, an enzyme that works the same way divine punishment does, quietly and then all at once. And slowly the miracle begins. Curds form, the milk thickens, the whey separates, pale and cloudy, sloshing with a gentle sigh as you stir. It's oddly satisfying, like alchemy, but with fewer explosions and more burping later. As the curds are gathered and pressed into wooden molds, Brother Cormac grumbles something about last week's batch turning like a heretic. He means it's soured, but you swear he looks personally offended. That's the thing about cheesemaking in the monastery. It's never just about the food. It's about the effort, the memory, the quiet hope that this batch will be better. Historians still argue whether monks truly innovated cheesemaking, or if they were just meticulous record keepers who didn't die often enough for their notes to disappear. But there's no doubt that many of the classic cheeses we know today, Parmesan, Limburger, Port Salut, were shaped by the hands of monks in drafty kitchens like this one, muttering prayers over curds and hoping God forgives dairy-related accidents. One particularly fascinating example is the invention of washed rind cheeses. These are the stinky ones, orange, sticky, and frequently banned from polite households. Legend has it that a monk accidentally spilled beer over a wheel of cheese and, instead of tossing it, decided to rub the rind regularly to cleanse it. The result? A cheese with intense smell but surprisingly mild taste. A culinary paradox, just like monks. There's a beauty to the process, the waiting, the watching, the dozens of tiny decisions, how much salt to add, when to flip, how long to age. And monks, trained to live slowly and observe deeply, were ideal for this kind of work. Cheese doesn't reward impatience. Neither does monastic life. You help carry the new wheels down to the cellar. Yes, the cellar again, and place them carefully on aging shelves. Some shelves are marked with chalk, others with tiny carvings. One particularly dramatic inscription reads, "Lord, deliver us from the rind." A prayer? A joke? A warning? Hard to say. Cheese aging isn't glamorous. The wheels sit there day after day, absorbing moisture, releasing gas, growing mold. Occasionally one cracks. Sometimes they puff up like overconfident bread. Every few days, a monk comes down to flip them, brush them, or sniff them and sigh. It's a process full of waiting, failure, and the faint hope that time will make things better. Kind of like spiritual growth, which is why it's not surprising that monks use cheese metaphors in sermons. The soul must be pressed like curd, that one friar wrote, lest it remain soft and spoiled. Another claimed, a man who resists correction is like a cheese left unflipped, rank on one side, pale on the other. Ouch. But vivid. And it worked. These metaphors stuck, because monks knew cheese. They knew how it changed, how it turned, how it could nourish or destroy depending on how you treated it. They saw themselves in the process, soft beginnings, harsh pressings, a long, moldy wait for something worthy to emerge. Later that afternoon, as you scrub out the vat with a coarse brush in freezing water, you catch Brother Cormac humming. It's not a hymn. It's something older. Maybe a folk song from his pre-monastic life, back when he had a name that didn't start with brother. You don't ask, but you hum along, softly. The kitchen smells of milk and steam. Your hands ache. Your robe is damp. But for once, there's no lingering dairy regret. Just the quiet satisfaction of having participated in something that's been done for over 1,000 years. You did it badly, but you did it. And maybe in the quiet churn of monkhood, that's enough. You wake the next morning to the sound of distant clanging. Someone, somewhere, has dropped a pot. Again, you stretch, sore from kitchen duty, and wonder why your back feels like you were wrestling barrels instead of curds. But your belly? Calm, surprisingly calm. No churn, no regret, no theological reflections on digestion. It's a miracle. You rise, robed, and make your way toward the cloister for another long day of prayers, copying, and hopefully non-haunted cheese. On your way, you pass a small alcove that houses the monastery's collection of books. Not just scriptures and sermons, but everything else too. Chronicles, herbals, travel records, and cookbooks. Yes, medieval monks had cookbooks. Or, more accurately, collections of instructions for preparation, often written in the margins of larger works or in their own small volumes, with titles like De Coquina Monastica or Libro Sciborum Fratrum. Most were less about culinary flair and more about what wouldn't kill you, or at least what wouldn't upset prayers with excessive burping. You sneak into the book alcove after morning prayers and find one such tome, brittle parchment, dark ink, and the smell of old wax and onion skins. Inside, you find not just lists of ingredients, but monastic wisdom on food, phrased with the solemnity of Scripture. Boil the lentils until they yield like the humble heart. Add salt, but not pride. If cheese must be served, let it be cut thinly, like vanity shaved from the soul. They weren't joking around. But amid the pious metaphors and long-winded blessings, you find something even more intriguing. A list of forbidden recipes. Yes, forbidden. Not because the ingredients were sinful, but because the final product was too pleasing. That's right. Some cheeses were banned because they tasted too good. One entry reads, "The cheese of spring herbs must not be served during Lent, lest the brothers desire more than they require." Another warns against a soft cheese made with pressed sheep's cream and holy basil, describing it as delightful to the tongue and thus dangerous to the soul. Historians still argue whether these warnings were taken seriously or simply served as reminders that monastic eating was meant to be functional, not festive. But the bans existed, and they point to a larger tension in monastic kitchens. The fear of enjoying food too much. The rule of St. Benedict didn't outright condemn pleasure, but it did warn against attachment. Monks were to accept their food gratefully, eat in moderation, and not fuss over taste, which is difficult when your cheese smells like angels and melts like grace. This tension led to fascinating culinary workarounds. Monks created substitute feasts, simple dishes that looked decadent but weren't. For example, bread soaked in watered wine, toasted to simulate roast meat. Or cheese made from ground almonds and oil, served to those abstaining from dairy altogether. And then there was the great deception, fake cheese. That's right. Almond cheese, made by grinding soaked almonds into a paste and mixing it with salt and a dash of vinegar, was served during periods of strict abstinence. It wasn't particularly tasty, but it looked like cheese. And more importantly, it wasn't cheese. So it didn't risk offending God or your digestive tract. Still, the records show that even these substitutes caused drama. One monk wrote, "Though no milk was used, my stomach was not persuaded. The almond cheese rebelled with the spirit of its cousin." He then added a doodle of a wheel with fangs. Some monasteries even tried complete culinary minimalism, boiled barley, unsalted porridge, crushed legumes. But over time, even the dullest dishes developed their own sense of indulgence. A slice of beet tucked under bread, a drizzle of honey slipped into lentil mash. Each act was a small rebellion against the flat gray of spiritual neutrality. Which brings you to the monks who went the other direction entirely. The flavor radicals. These were the cooks who believed that beauty in food could lead to beauty in prayer. The Cluniacs, for example, embraced rich cooking, believing that honoring God through lavish meals wasn't gluttony, it was reverence. They used imported spices, fine cheeses, carefully layered herbs. Their kitchens were renowned, and also frequently judged. One Cistercian abbot wrote in disgust, "They eat like bishops and sleep like clouds. No trial enters their belly." Oof. But these differences weren't just culinary. They were philosophical. What was the purpose of food in monastic life? Was it sustenance, temptation, or praise? You sit cross-legged in the book alcove, the recipe book open on your knees, reading lines scrawled centuries ago by a monk probably as conflicted about his dairy choices as you are now. And then, in the margins, you find a tiny note. "If this be sin, let it be mild, and let my cheese forgive me." You smile. It's not a prayer. It's not a recipe. It's just honest. Later that day, when you return to the refectory, you notice something small has changed. The cheese tonight isn't terrifying. It's fine, firm, balanced. Someone has sliced it carefully and placed it on each plate with quiet intention. Brother Cormac nods at you across the table, the faintest twitch of respect in his beard, and for the first time in a while, you eat your cheese without fear. Not because it's harmless, but because you understand it now. That evening, as the candles flicker and your fellow monks drift off into soft, cheese-muted snores, you lie awake, thinking. Not about discomfort this time, but about legacy. About how something as humble, as frustrating, as gastrointestinally suspicious as cheese could persist through centuries of prayer, poverty, and poorly ventilated kitchens. Because here's the secret. Monks didn't just complain about cheese. They preserved it, literally and figuratively. Your mind wanders back to the cellar, to the rows of aging wheels, each one a little time capsule of weather, effort, milk, and mood. The monks didn't just store them for themselves, they stored them for the future. Cheese became an archive, a tradition handed down like a chant or a psalm, and not just in taste, in writing. Across Europe, abbeys kept dairying manuals, carefully handwritten texts containing everything from milk handling techniques to aging advice to mystical warnings about cheese turned by the breath of sin. Some were serious, methodical, others unhinged. One French tract includes this gem. If your cheese hisses at dawn, it carries the wrath of Michael. Bold claim. Historians still argue whether this is metaphor or not, but it shows just how intertwined food and faith had become. Cheese wasn't just nourishment. It was a lesson, a test, a spiritual allegory in rennet form. And yet there's something else these records show, something quieter, a pattern. You see scribes revising each other's instructions, adding improvements, notes in the margins. You see care. One monk adds, "Too much salt ruins sweetness, balance is best." Another, a century later, writes simply, "Yes." They were talking about cheese, but maybe not just cheese. You realize with a smile that monastic dairy wasn't merely about feeding bodies. It was about connecting across generations, through curd and ink, through mistakes and mold. Cheese became a language, a way to say, "I was here, I tried, I got sick once, but I figured it out. Here's what helped." You think of the margins again, the doodles, the Latin sighs, the terrible cheese poems. Those monks weren't just venting. They were humanizing their work, sneaking in moments of levity between lines of divine law. Caesius me triet in vanitatum. The cheese draws me into vanity. There's humor there, vulnerability, a small rebellion wrapped in wax and tucked between chapters of salvation. And beyond the monasteries, cheese carried on. Lay brothers and visiting novices brought those techniques back to villages, towns, even cities. Recipes spread, regional varieties flourished, not in spite of monastic severity, but because of it. Because the monks cared enough to get it wrong again and again until they got it right. Even today, echoes of their struggle linger. Modern cheesemakers still borrow terms from the Latin, coagulum, caseus, lactus. Some wheels still bear the marks of abbeys long dissolved. And those who age cheese, who wash, flip, pat, pray, still follow rhythms first laid down by candlelight on stone floors, by tired hands and grumbling stomachs. You think about that strange mixture of frustration and reverence, about how often monks compared cheese to virtue aged through trial, to flesh resisting rot, to hope held firm through time. Those are beautiful thoughts, possibly lactose-induced, but beautiful. And maybe that's the point. The cheese wasn't perfect. The monks weren't perfect. The prayers didn't always help, but they kept going. They learned. They left traces. And now, centuries later, you're lying in their scratchy bedding, wearing the same robes, holding the same belly, and smiling at the same absurdity. Because something survived. Not just a recipe, not just a smell, but a story. You roll onto your side, finally drifting off, and dream not of saints or sinners, but of monks doodling grumpy cheese angels in the corners of psalters, and scribes adding notes like "this curd will not submit." And you think, just before sleep takes you, maybe neither will I. You're back in the scriptorium, quill in hand, parchment under elbow, and somewhere between copying Deuteronomium and not spilling ink on your habit, your mind drifts again. To cheese, of course. The guilt at this point is manageable. Everyone's been there. You glance around the room. Brother Tomas is nose deep in a psalter, but his left hand is suspiciously clutching something cloth-wrapped and crumbly. Brother Julian is scratching a marginal note in a bestiary, something about cow beasts of soft flesh and pungent breath. That's not canon, but it is probably dairy related. Today's task is simple: transcribe a moral tale, a fable of sorts, written long ago by some anonymous monk whose patience had clearly run out. The tale begins. There was once a wheel of cheese, proud and full of itself. You smile, because even in allegory, cheese continues to haunt this place. The story that unfolds is as unsubtle as you'd expect. The proud cheese refuses to be sliced, refuses to age quietly, and ultimately collapses under its own ambition, stinking and unshared. The moral? He who cannot be cut shall not be consumed. This is, of course, a metaphor for humility, but it's also clearly based on someone's real lunch gone horribly wrong. And you love that. It's history, theology, and passive aggression all in one fermented bundle. This blending of moral instruction and everyday experience was a hallmark of monastic writing. Monks used cheese as metaphor constantly, not because they lacked imagination, but because it worked. Cheese is alive. It transforms. It can nourish or revolt. It hides danger under a pleasing rind. Historians still argue whether this constant cheesing of moral lessons was sincere or satirical. Some scholars believe monks had a rich tradition of humor tucked between their solemn duties. Others insist it was all deadly serious. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle, like a soft wheel left too close to the hearth. As you copy the tale, you add a small note in the margin. We have known this cheese. No one will notice. Or maybe they will. You pause to stretch your fingers and glance at the walls. Behind you are shelves stacked with copied books, Bibles, saints' lives, recipes, herbal lore, and those strange little wisdom tracts filled with advice like, do not eat fish and cheese on the same plate lest your bowels quarrel. That particular gem appears three times in 3 different books, in 3 different scripts. You suspect it was a proverb, or maybe just a shared trauma. There's something comforting about knowing that monks didn't just preserve scripture, they preserved suffering. They immortalized indigestion, documented disappointment, and still managed to do so in flowing calligraphy with illuminated initials shaped like goats. Your quill scratches again. You finish the tale, ink drying fast in the afternoon warmth. Outside, you hear bees buzzing near the lavender patch, and somewhere down the corridor, a faint, probably a cheese knife hitting stone. After your scribing duties are done, you wander through the library. You find a peculiar volume, rare, dusty, and bound in cracked leather. No title, just a single line inside the front cover. Caesius est via. Cheese is the way. It's hard to tell if this is a joke, a devotional, or a misfiled culinary manual. But what follows are pages of reflections, some poetic, some absurd, on the spiritual symbolism of cheese. One page muses. In the rind, we see endurance. In the mold, humility. In the scent, remembrance. Another boldly declares, there is no heaven without cheese, for even paradise must ferment. You're pretty sure that's heretical, but you keep reading. These are not official teachings. These are monks thinking aloud, dreaming, reflecting, laughing softly into their sleeves. The way we all do when the world is quiet and the bread is warm. As twilight descends, you return the book to its shelf and step into the cool stone corridor. The monastery hums with low voices and the shuffle of sandals. Dinner approaches. You can already smell stew, lentils, root vegetables, a whisper of thyme. And yes, cheese. Just a sliver tonight. You've earned that much. As you walk past the refectory, you pause at the door. A novice is reading from a devotional text as the others eat in silence. His voice echoes down the hall. We must not desire the rind alone, nor reject the curd. The whole wheel is given. The whole wheel must be received. You smile. Another metaphor. Another meal. You take your seat at the long wooden table, lift your spoon, and offer a quiet prayer, not for protection from cheese, but for understanding. Because in this monastery, that might be all you ever really get. The days pass like soft footfalls on old stone. Your chores change. Garden one day, scriptorium the next. A few quiet hours assisting in the apothecary where Brother Lucian labels dried fennel with reverence usually reserved for relics. But the cheese, ever present, lingers in thought, in scent, in spiritual metaphor. You can't escape it. You don't really want to. Today, you're sent to assist in the guest kitchen, where travelers, pilgrims, yell, and the occasional noble on retreat are fed more generously than the cloistered brothers. The rules are flexible here. And the cheese? Scandalously good. You're not supposed to say that, but you're not wrong. As you slice through a supple golden wheel, its aroma wafting like a prayer answered in dairy, you remember a line from the rule: let all guests be welcomed as Christ. And apparently, Christ prefers semi-soft goat cheese aged with rosemary and divine intention. The guest master, a cheerful man named Brother Peter, tells you a secret. This batch was a festival cheese, made months ago for a saint's day that was postponed due to rain and general disinterest. So we saved it, he whispers, for someone who might need a little mercy. You don't ask who that someone is. You already suspect it's all of you. As you plate the slices beside warm bread and plums, you notice a traveler in the courtyard, a woman in a travel-stained cloak, resting her feet. A pilgrim. You bring her a portion. She accepts it with a nod and begins to eat with the quiet, focused gratitude of someone who hasn't had a hot meal in days. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. And watching her, you realize something simple. Cheese brings people together. Even when it offends, when it smells, when it disagrees with half the digestive systems in Christendom, it unites. It's the center of a meal, a conversation starter, a reason for laughter, complaint, sharing. Even the monks who complained most about cheese, who wrote laments in Latin, who swore it was a test from God, still ate it, still served it, still passed it around the table like a bitter joke they couldn't stop telling. Historians still argue whether monastic meals were truly silent, or if the brothers whispered when the abbot wasn't looking. One account claims that in some monasteries, meals were accompanied by hand gestures, complex signals meaning, please pass, too much salt, or presumably, this cheese is going to kill me. Others say they hummed softly through their noses. One monk's diary simply reads, we are silent, but not still. You believe it. Silence doesn't stop communion. If anything, it deepens it. Back in the guest kitchen, Brother Peter wipes his hands on his robe and tells you stories between batches of bread. He speaks of the cheese monk of Cologne, who once tried to brine his wheels in holy water and accidentally created a local delicacy. Of the abbess who sent wheels of cheese as dowries for orphaned girls. Of the hermit who lived on nothing but sheep's curd and dew and was canonized for his patience, not with people, but with fermentation. You realize again that the story of cheese is the story of persistence. The monks didn't make cheese because it was easy. They made it because it was necessary. And then they kept doing it year after year through plague, famine, schism, reform, because it worked most of the time. And when it didn't, they wrote about it. They preserved their failures. They laughed at them. They sketched them in the margins of their psalms. You finish the evening scrubbing bowls, humming one of the old cheese hymns under your breath, the one that ends, blessed be the curd and crust, though it betray our mortal trust, still we dine and still we must. There's wisdom there, more than you first realized. The monastery bell rings Compline. Time for final prayers. You dry your hands and walk back toward the chapel under a sky smeared with soft purple. You pass the cheese cellar on the way. You stop. You peer in. The wheels rest like sleeping animals. You think, they've aged. So have I. Tomorrow, there will be more slicing, more stirring, more stories. Some about saints, some about stomachs. All of them. Holy, in their own way. And now, with the quiet closing around you like a warm cowl, you take your place among the others for prayer. And know, you are exactly where you're meant to be. Cheese and all. The moon is high and pale as you settle into your cot for the night. Your robe folded neatly, your sandals aligned with quiet devotion, your stomach surprisingly tranquil. No ominous gurgles, no churn of regret, just a calm, slow warmth in your belly, and the echo of evening chants still humming in your chest like a fading bell. You lie on your side, hands tucked beneath your cheek, and allow your thoughts to wander, gently now, like cows across a distant field. You think not about scripture or psalms, not about penance or pride, but about something far more persistent. Cheese, of course. Because it's always there. In the kitchens, in the texts, in the air itself. You smell it faintly now, nutty, sweet, a little sour. A presence as common as incense, as dependable as prayer. And you realize something simple, something beautiful. Monks never gave up on cheese. No matter how many batches went wrong, how many meals ended in discomfort, how many complaints they inked into margins or whispered behind spoons, they returned to it, day after day, season after season. Not because they were gluttons, but because they were hopeful. hopeful that this time it would turn out just right, that the milk would set, that the rind would bloom, that something soft and humble could become, through time and pressure, something strong. That's the rhythm of the monastery, of life, really. And it's written in the wheels. The first taste may offend, the second might confuse. But by the third, you're not just tasting cheese, you're tasting memory, intention, effort. You're tasting the hands that pressed it, the cellars that aged it, the laughter and swearing and hymns sung over it. You're tasting time. Historians still argue whether monks made the best cheese or merely the most persistent, whether their legacy was culinary or spiritual. But perhaps they're asking the wrong question, because cheese wasn't their masterpiece. Cheese was their metaphor, a metaphor for transformation, for patience, for faith, for enduring through mold, through cracks, through judgment, and still becoming something someone might love. You shift slightly, listening to the low creak of ancient wood, and remember something Brother Cormac muttered while flipping a wheel earlier today. His voice gravely, beard flecked with crumbs, he said, "If you want it mild, you have to wait. If you want it sharp, you have to suffer." He was talking about cheese, but also he wasn't. You smile in the dark. The monastery sleeps, the cheese ages, the world turns slowly toward morning, and somewhere in the cellar a wheel lets out a soft, blessed hiss. Wind down. The candles are low now. Only embers glow behind your eyes. You breathe in, slow, warm, steady. Let the rhythm of ancient stone and quiet faith settle across your thoughts like a woolen blanket drawn soft around your shoulders. The cheese, the monks, the chants, the cellars, all drift behind you now like distant bells fading in the fog. Let your muscles loosen. Let the last flickers of laughter over moldy wheels and misbehaving rinds slide gently into stillness. You picture the monastery in the moonlight, cool stones warmed by memory, windows glowing faintly, the night air crisp with lavender and earth. Inside, the brothers sleep, their robes folded, their burdens softened, their stories written not only in books, but in recipes, in prayers, in tiny cheese-stained scraps tucked into time. And beneath them, in that quiet cellar, the wheels rest too, wrapped in cloth, kissed by patience, changing slowly in the dark. Because that's what cheese does. It changes. It waits. It teaches you to let go, to forgive, to trust the long process of becoming. You are not so different. So now, let your breath grow longer. Let your thoughts melt like soft curd in warm hands. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through kitchens and gardens and libraries filled with strange wisdom and soft humility. You've learned, laughed, and lingered. And now you rest. The rind will hold. The cellar is cool. The monks are watching. Sleep, gentle friend, sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.